In the summer of 2024, a fund owned by 5.6 million Norwegians voted against Elon Musk's pay package. Not a government, not a regulator, a fund. And the package it rejected, $56 billion in Tesla compensation, was the largest proposed executive pay deal in corporate history. Musk called the fund's CEO a very dumb man on social media. He declined a dinner invitation. The fund kept the vote. The fund that did this is called the Government Pension Fund Global. It is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. It owns approximately 1.5% of every listed company on Earth, around 8,700 companies in 63 countries. That includes Apple, Microsoft, Samsung, Nestle, Shell, Barclays, LVMH, every company in the FTSE 100, roughly every company in the S&P 500, and it is owned in equal shares by every Norwegian citizen, each of whom has a notional stake worth more than $300,000. This is the story of how Norway, a country of 5.6 million people, became the largest single shareholder in the global economy. What they did that every other oil-rich country failed to do. And what happens when the oil runs out. Before the fund, you need to understand the problem it was designed to solve. Because Norway did not build the system out of cleverness alone. It built it because it watched every other country that struck oil make the same catastrophic mistake, and it was determined not to repeat it. That mistake has a name, Dutch disease. And if you want to understand why Norway's fund is genuinely extraordinary, you need to feel how common the failure it replaced actually is. Dutch disease gets its name from the Netherlands in the 1960s, when the discovery of large North Sea natural gas reserves caused the Dutch guilder to appreciate sharply. The surge in currency value made Dutch manufacturing exports uncompetitive overnight. Industries that had nothing to do with gas, textiles, machinery, chemicals, shrank or collapsed because their products were suddenly too expensive for foreign buyers. The pattern repeats across every resource-rich economy. A country discovers oil. Export revenues flood in. The local currency strengthens. Non-oil industries become uncompetitive. The economy narrows until it depends almost entirely on the commodity. When the commodity price falls, or when the reserves run out, there is nothing left to fall back on. Nigeria has earned more than $600 billion in oil revenues since 1960. Most of its citizens are among the poorest in the world. Venezuela had the largest proven oil reserves on Earth and experienced economic collapse. Libya, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, the pattern holds across decades and continents. Norway discovered significant oil and gas reserves in the North Sea in 1969. The government's first instinct was caution. It imposed heavy taxes on oil companies. The marginal tax rate on petroleum profits reached 78%, and placed strict regulatory controls on production rates. But taxing the oil and spending the revenues domestically would still cause Dutch disease. The krona would still appreciate. Norwegian industry would still be crowded out. The problem was not just how to capture the revenues. It was what to do with them once captured. It took 20 years of political debate for Norway to reach the answer. But in 1990, the Norwegian parliament passed legislation that contained one rule so counterintuitive that it has been called the single most important economic decision Norway ever made. All oil revenues would be invested abroad. Not a single krona of petroleum money would be spent inside Norway without parliamentary approval. The fund would exist entirely outside the Norwegian economy. The architecture of the fund is worth understanding in detail because it is not what most people assume it is, and the specific design choices Norway made are precisely what give it both its extraordinary scale and its political durability. This is not a fund that makes strategic bets, buys trophy assets, or serves the geopolitical interests of a ruling family. Understanding what it actually does is what makes it surprising. The fund is not a separate legal entity. It is a deposit account at the Central Bank of Norway, Norges Bank, into which the government deposits all petroleum revenues. The actual investment operation is run by Norges Bank Investment Management, NBIM, a unit of the central bank with about 700 employees. The Ministry of Finance sets the investment strategy and the ethical guidelines. Parliament must approve any significant changes. No individual minister, prime minister, or political party controls where the money goes. The investment mandate is deliberately passive. Rather than picking winners, NBIM largely tracks global indexes, buying small stakes in thousands of companies in proportion to their weight in world markets. Around 72% of the fund is in global equities, 25% in fixed income investments, and roughly 3% in unlisted real estate, commercial properties in New York, London, Paris, San Francisco, and Tokyo. The fund does not take controlling stakes. It does not sit on boards. Its largest holding in any single company is typically between 1% and 3%. There is one spending rule, and it is ironclad. Each year, the Norwegian government may draw on the fund's expected real return, currently estimated at around 3% annually, to fund the national budget. Not the principal, not the oil revenues, only the investment return. This is called the fiscal rule, and it means the fund itself is never consumed. Only the income it generates enters the Norwegian economy. The first deposit into the fund was made in 1996. At that point, oil revenues had been flowing for 25 years, and the fund received its first 2 billion kroner. By 2024, the fund held 19 trillion kroner, roughly $1.77 trillion. That is more than $300,000 for every Norwegian citizen. And because the fiscal rule prevents the principal from being spent, that figure keeps growing even as Norway draws an annual income from it. The fund now generates more income for Norway than oil production itself. The fund owns approximately 1.5% of every listed company in the world. That sounds abstract until you trace what it means in practice, because the portfolio touches almost every significant business that exists, and the specific names in it reveal something about how quietly enormous this position actually is. The key detail most people miss: the fund does not announce its full portfolio in real time. NBIM publishes detailed quarterly and annual reports, but the complete picture of what 5.6 million Norwegians own, spread across 8,700 companies in 63 countries, is not a list most people have ever seen. If this kind of breakdown is useful, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you get the next video automatically. Anyway, the fund's 5 largest single equity holdings as of 2024 were Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Alphabet, and Amazon, the 5 most valuable companies in the world. In Apple alone, the fund held shares worth more than $20 billion, representing roughly 1% of the company. Its Tesla holding, the one at the center of the Musk dispute, was worth approximately $14.2 billion. In property, the fund owns buildings at 1221 Avenue of the Americas in New York. It holds stakes on Regent Street in London. It owns commercial real estate in Times Square, in Paris's 8th arrondissement, in San Francisco's financial district, and in central Tokyo. These are not passive financial instruments. They are physical buildings in the most expensive real estate markets on Earth, owned on behalf of Norwegian citizens who will mostly never set foot in them. The fund's scale gives it shareholder influence that most governments do not possess. In 2024, NBIM voted on more than 120,000 agenda items at company annual general meetings across the world, on executive pay, climate disclosure, board composition, and human rights policies. When a fund owning 1% to 3% of a company votes against management, it moves markets and triggers board conversations. The Musk vote was not an outlier. It was the visible surface of a systematic governance operation that runs quietly every day across 8,700 companies. Put plainly, the next time you use an iPhone, open a Microsoft document, search on Google, or watch a film on Amazon Prime, a fraction of the revenue those companies generate will eventually flow through dividends and share price appreciation to a fund owned equally by every Norwegian citizen. Norway has turned its North Sea oil into a permanent financial stake in the global economy. The oil is extracted once. The investments compound indefinitely. Here's the part of the Norway fund story that almost nobody outside financial circles discusses. And it matters as much as the size of the portfolio, because it reveals what kind of investor this actually is. The fund does not simply buy the world, it maintains a blacklist. And the criteria for ending up on it tell you something important about how Norway has chosen to use the leverage that $1.77 trillion of assets provides. Since 2004, the fund has operated under ethical guidelines set by the Finance Ministry and administered by an independent body called the Council on Ethics. The Council assesses companies in the portfolio against a set of criteria: production of cluster munitions, nuclear weapons, or anti-personnel landmines leads to automatic exclusion. So does tobacco production. So does deriving more than 30% of revenues from coal. Companies found to have committed gross corruption, serious violations of human rights or labor rights, or severe environmental damage face exclusion based on their conduct. By the end of 2024, the fund had excluded more than 170 companies on conduct and product grounds. The excluded include global names: Las Vegas Sands and MGM Resorts for casino operations, Philip Morris and British American Tobacco for tobacco, Adani Ports for business connections with the armed forces of Myanmar, the Israeli communications company Bezek for operating telecommunications infrastructure serving settlements in the occupied West Bank deemed illegal under international law. To be fair here, and this channel will always tell you when something is genuinely contested, the Ethics Council's decisions are not universally praised. Critics have argued the exclusion criteria are applied inconsistently. Israeli companies face exclusion rates significantly higher than companies from countries with worse human rights records, including China and several Gulf states. In 2025, Norway's parliament launched a formal review of the ethical guidelines, with particular focus on whether the framework is applied even-handedly across geographies. The debate about whether a sovereign wealth fund should have ethical investment criteria at all, or whether it inevitably becomes a tool of political pressure, is live and unresolved. What the blacklist demonstrates, regardless of the debates around its application, is that the Norway Fund is not a passive instrument. It is a vehicle through which a small democratic country is making active choices about what kind of economic activity it is willing to finance. Those choices have consequences for the companies on the list. Exclusion from a $1.77 trillion fund triggers immediate market reactions and reputational scrutiny that no company board ignores. The fund did not set out to be a regulator, but at its current scale, the distinction is academic. Norway's oil fund is widely held up as the gold standard of sovereign wealth management, the model every resource-rich country should follow. That reputation is largely earned. But there is a set of problems with the fund that barely get discussed outside Norway, and they matter because they complicate the clean success story considerably. If you only understand the fund's size and structure, you understand the asset. You don't understand the liability that comes with it. The first problem is dependency. The fiscal rule was designed to limit how much of the fund's returns could enter the Norwegian economy each year, capped at the expected real return of around 3%. The intention was to prevent Norwegian governments from spending oil money recklessly. In practice, the fund has grown so large that even 3% of $1.77 trillion is a sum that the Norwegian state has become structurally dependent on. The fund now finances roughly 20% of Norway's entire government budget. Norwegian politicians have become so accustomed to this income stream that economists have raised serious questions about what happens to the domestic economy, domestic industry, and domestic productivity when that income is no longer growing. There are already signs. With the fund generating extraordinary returns, Norway has had less pressure to develop internationally competitive non-oil industries than comparable small economies. Critics have described a quiet version of Dutch disease, not in the traditional sense of a strong currency crowding out exports, but in the subtler sense of an economy that no longer needs to compete as hard because the fund underwrites the result regardless. The second problem is market exposure. In the first quarter of 2025, the fund reported a loss of approximately $40 billion, a 0.1% decline, driven by U.S. market turbulence following President Trump's tariff announcements. Around 40% of the fund's equity holdings are in U.S. companies. A sustained U.S. market correction, a dollar depreciation, or a trade war that structurally damages global equity values would be felt directly by the Norwegian state budget. Norway has, in its attempt to escape dependence on one commodity, created a form of dependence on global financial markets that is arguably harder to hedge. The third problem is the oil itself. The fund was created to manage the revenues of a finite resource and invest them for the long term. But Norway continues to produce oil and gas, and under pressure from global energy markets intensified by the Russia-Ukraine war, production has increased rather than declined. For a country that positions itself as a leader on climate and ethical investment, the gap between the fund's ethical exclusion of coal companies and Norway's own status as Western Europe's largest oil and gas producer is a tension that has not been resolved. Norway built an extraordinary thing, a fund that turned a temporary natural resource into a permanent financial position in the global economy, a system that protected the domestic economy from the volatility of commodity prices, a mechanism that will provide income to Norwegians long after the last barrel of North Sea crude is extracted. The problems that come with it are the problems of success: dependency on the income stream the fund generates, vulnerability to global market swings, and the unresolved contradiction between ethical investment criteria and the continued extraction that funds it. None of those problems reduce what was achieved. They complicate a clean narrative that is often told without them. The fund now generates more income for Norway than its oil fields do. Every Norwegian citizen has a notional stake worth more than $300,000 in a portfolio that owns 1.5% of every major company on Earth. The structural decision taken in 1990 to invest all oil revenues abroad, to spend only the returns, and to keep the principal growing indefinitely is the reason the fund exists at the scale it does. What Norway did was not clever in a complicated way. It was disciplined in a simple way. It said, the oil is temporary, the investments can be permanent. And it built a system designed to make that true, and then defended that system against 20 years of political pressure to spend the money faster. The Musk vote was a footnote. The fund casting that vote on behalf of every Norwegian citizen, with no political instruction from any government minister, with the full weight of $14 billion in Tesla shares behind it, was the system working exactly as it was designed to work in 1990. Norway discovered oil in 1969 and took 20 years to decide what to do with it. That discipline, the willingness to delay spending, to invest abroad, to resist short-term pressure, is what the fund is built on. There is a country just to the west of Norway that discovered what happens when the opposite choices are made. In 2003, its three largest banks embarked on one of the most reckless expansions in financial history, borrowing internationally, buying West Ham United, acquiring retailers across Britain, attracting 300,000 foreign depositors with interest rates above 5%. By 2008, those three banks had combined debts of $182 billion. The country's entire GDP was $17 billion. All three banks collapsed within 72 hours. And then Iceland did something no other country did. It let the banks fail. It jailed the bankers. It let the currency fall. And it recovered faster than Ireland, Greece, or Portugal. Every country that chose the bailout instead. That video explains exactly how and what it means for how financial crises are actually handled. It is on this channel right now.